Welcome to Your Authentic Executive. Today's guest is Thomas Saller. Thomas is an executive coach, a partner at 5L Partners, a management consultant with a focus on change management. He's a trusted advisor to senior leaders across Europe and beyond. I thought we would start by looking at kind of change, past and present, and kind of what worked before. And so if we start by looking in the rearview mirror, if you think about what were the best practices for leading change earlier in your consulting career, go back a decade, go back 2 decades, kind of what things really worked?
That's interesting. Thank you very much one more time for having me. It's very interesting to really think a little bit back on how things used to be in the beginning of my career. And I think you mentioned, Janine, that I'm mainly operating in Europe and within Europe in Germany, partly in France, partly in Austria, Italy, Switzerland. But what I do remember, I have a background in business psychology, is that in the very beginning of my career, people were very, very suspect still when they even heard that somebody is a psychologist. Yeah? So the stuff that you would hear is like, oh, do I need a personal shrink here now? Am I gonna have to sit on the sofa? Why is this important at all? So, and that was actually starting pretty much in 2003 when I started, first of all, in Procter & Gamble, and then later on, so I worked in a corporate world, an American company, but in the German headquarters, and then later on as a consultant to bring these ideas into corporates. That in the beginning, it was still for a lot of people magic to just start thinking about and talking about feelings. Huh? So back then, it was still eye-opening for a lot of executives to simply show them something like the change curve and tell people, here, that's what people are going through. That's the emotions that people experience. Oh, wow, we're talking emotions here. Is this true? Are we allowed to? Is this normal? And that, to be honest, in the late 2000s, it became more and more of a norm. Even the word change management did hardly exist. So, and then you started seeing more and more open job postings internally and also externally about people talking about, yes, we need a change agent, we need change managers, we need consultants to deal with this. But at least here in Europe, back then it was already something new and partly almost forbidden to even start to talk about these kind of things.
You know, that makes me think back earlier in my career. I'm 63, so I've been around a while. I've been doing this over 30 years. And earlier in my career, I worked for a corporation for a period of time. It was a best places to work corporation. Started as a recruiter, then moved into training and development, and then organizational development, which was a very new discipline at that time. And I remember that the company kept hiring what they thought would be an executive that would come in and transform the organization. And we'd get this email announcing who they are and what they were going to do. And it was all exciting. And I kept thinking, again, I was a young person, so this was this discernment that I kind of have when I look at organizations. And I kept thinking what they're doing is they keep sticking on a bionic arm, but they haven't taken the antibiotics in the system to make sure that the bionic arm sticks. And so it falls off, that the hires wouldn't last. And so it was almost like if I go get something and put it here, it'll fix the system and it'll fix the people, as opposed to what do we need to do in an organization in order to transform? What do we need to do, even thinking about change management and the psychological process that human beings go as a natural, normal response to change? And so I'm curious if you have any war stories that kind of go back to those early days, maybe something that worked or something that didn't work.
I mean, that's, I think I can talk about it nowadays. Back then in 2005, 2006, P&G was buying a company called Gillette. I mean, and the brand.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And at the same time, P&G bought a company called Vela Professional. So I think worldwide, it was clearly more P&G employees than Gillette and Vela employees. But if you looked in Germany, you had basically 6,000 people from P&G, 6,000 from Gillette Brown, and 6,000 from Vella. So it was quite interesting. And back then, I was not yet in the leading position, but we had some very smart organizational development folks internally, and they developed a training that all leaders and later on all employees had to go through from the acquiring side from P&G, and where they talked about the famous change curve with shock, denial, rational understanding, and so on, and talked about the phase shift that this curve has depending on in which position you are. So basically, for some people who hear about the change first, they go through this change curve faster than others. And also that how different people experience the curve based on if they are on the acquiring side or if they are being acquired. Yeah? And so I still remember that a lot of people sitting in these workshops from the Gillette side, and they said, yes, I can still remember 28th of January 2005. We went to the office, we turned on the computer, and we said, oh, we've been sold, and we were under shock, and we were paralyzed, and we couldn't do anything for the whole day. We were just like, what's going to happen to us? And then you had some P&G guys saying, well, but when we acquired the company, we said, oh, cool, another company. Let's look what are the products that they have in the company shops. Cool. From now on, we can have the Gillette Venus cheaper in the company shop. And that's about it. And this workshop was so eye-opening for a lot of people to really see, wow, my emotion is not your emotion. And we cannot assume that simply because it's easy for us, it's easy for other people. And that was, I think, really the game changer for this acquisition. By the way, it hadn't worked so well with Vella yet because Vella was still done in the classical way. Let's merge processes, structure systems, let's put them all together, and then it will work. And in Vella, we could back then see how more and more employees were leaving, how absenteeism, turnover rate, and so were getting bigger. And that's why P&G learned from it and really engaged in this program in organizational really in a change later on. There was also very streamlined change communication. So we're saying, let's make sure that we really sing all from the same song sheet, all top managers, we talk about it. Let's, for the new position, not automatically take the P&G people, but let's take the best of both worlds, that you have senior leaders from the Gillette side and so on. So there was much more focus on the human side of the whole element, and that really made a big difference. And I think that's why still nowadays you can say that this was a successful acquisition, while for Vella some people might say it was maybe not. So that was one of my very first experiences with this, where you gave people the permission to reflect upon the human side, the emotions, the potential resistance, the fears, and so on. Does this answer your question?
Oh yeah, it does. And it makes me think, so I don't know, 30 something years ago, some of the curriculum that I worked with was by Pritchett and Pound called Business is Unusual. Sounds like is that ringing a bell for you at all? No, but some of the content, and I still refer to this, is that change curve. William Bridges calls it transitions, and he said that change doesn't stick unless people make the psychological transition from how it was to how it's going to be. And the merger, the acquisition, the new car, the new house, the new boss, that's external. But the transition process is internal, and change doesn't stick until people move from the front end of change and denial or betrayal to the other side of searching for solutions, which is another label for acceptance. And when I walk through that, everybody goes, oh. Then the next thing I walk through is a slide that shows these cycles of executives going through it first, then middle managers, and then the new folks. And that's eye-opening because it means people are getting exposed to data at different times about what's going to happen, and being given an opportunity to begin to absorb and adapt to the change. But the most interesting kind of conversation we end up having is that because executives who are planning the change go through that process first, they're at the end saying, searching for solutions, let's get going. And when that happens, employees are hearing about it, and they're going through shock and denial, right? Or betrayal. And it's the people in the middle who just kind of started that process and are in what's called identity crisis. depression. And the middle managers are saying, I don't know if I understand my role. I don't know if I can make this work. I understand what's expected of me. Do I want to do this? Can I do this? Do I like where we're going? Do I want to stay here? And employees are saying, how could you do this to me? And the senior executives are saying, what is wrong with you? The train is moving. Get your team going. And so what's interesting when we share some of these, this is what is a natural, normal, predictable human response to change. All of a sudden they have a framework, and folks that are appearing resistant, executives understand, oh, they're going, okay, this is progress. Let's help them move forward. And so it sounds like you had a similar experience when walking through models like that.
And it still works. And it's interesting because in my earlier years, I still, there's this company that we both work together where the CEO calls it the Thomas Saller model. And I said, no, it's not me, it's Bridges. and of course, the classical sentence you still hear from C-level over them is, again and again, for me, the change is over. For me, it's done. Check mark. I said, yeah, of course it's done for you because you had 3 years to work on it. But other people just heard of it last week. Now you're fine to communicate. So give people time to digest. And grass will not grow faster when you pull it, right? And that's
good. Grass will not grow faster when you pull it. That's a wonderful quote. And it's interesting because one of the things that executives forget is that their fingers are usually not in the execution of the change.
Yep.
And so they've accepted the concept and the budget, the structural things, and they've had time to adapt to how that's going to affect them personally, but they are not going to be responsible for the nitty-gritty. And so even understanding that difference and why it feels ready to go and why and the cost of that impatience, it's this balance and Cotter. And I know that you've done some actual training with kind of the guru, John Cotter, that there's this balance between honoring the human process and helping people move along and the need for urgency.
And time to push on, right? I mean, you cannot wait for 10, 15 years on this. That's true. There's a very famous German proverb saying, der Teufel ist ein Eichhörnchen. Literally translated, the devil is a squirrel. I think it's a little bit translatable to the devil is in the detail. And of course, you as a CEO or CFO, you cannot look into what does my IT system X do when I click button B and C. But these are the questions that people have on a day-to-day basis. Really, the processes, the systems, the daily work routines and so on. And it's really hard, as you said, to find the balance between it. It will take time to clarify everything until people are happy to work with it. But of course, you cannot, in our faster moving world, you cannot give everybody eternally time, right? You need to constantly create the sense of urgency. And as Cotter says in step 7, don't let up. Huh? So don't declare victory too early, but really say we still have a long way to go. That's a tough one.
That's interesting. It makes me think of the picture that we have here in the United States. I don't know if it resonated with you in Europe, of a former president, President Bush, during I do not recall which of the campaigns it was when he was president, but it had begun, and he was on this ship in a parachuters or a pilot's uniform with this big banner behind him saying mission accomplished. And that was a typical executive flaw. We've launched it, we've started, it's done. And that's why 30%-ish of transformation efforts work and the other 70% fail because of the systems that are needed and the traction that is needed for the change to actually be sustainable over time. Which, interestingly, I don't know, have you encountered this? There's an organization I work with, again, earlier in my career, and every 3 years or so, a new general manager would come into this division. And so they would hire a new general manager that was responsible for a plant and an office. And when I went in to work with them, what I found was the long-standing executive team that would report to the general manager. They had gone through iterations of this cycle, and the general manager would launch this vision. Here's where we're going. And they learned to nod to the executive, and all of them would universally nod together at the conference table. And then how I described it was, then they would go do their job and they duck because they knew it would blow over. They knew in 3 to he'd be gone or she'd be gone. It was mostly he's, and we could go back to doing things the way that we wanted to do. And so it just so interesting how important longstanding employees and leaders learn the rhythm of the organization of trying and failing. And that is one of the big blocks that keeps things at the status quo. Does that, you look like you've got a good story.
It's very interesting because I just had a similar story in mind. And I think the importance, in Germany call it translated bend and wait. Yeah? So you bend a little bit, then the next executive will go, and then we can move back to normal. And this idea, especially in less egalitarian but more hierarchical companies, to really give candid upwards feedback, unpleasant feedback to C-levels, to also really that they ask for it. And that I have seen improving in my country in the last years, that C-level is more open. For example, last October was running a change initiative for a company, a software company, about 6,000 people who restructured. And they really established for the first time, based on the idea of the CFO and the CEO, so-called change agents. So they really educated altogether 36 people from all different fields, departments, countries, cost centers, normally from really the individual contributor level, and said, so your job will be to collect points that come in your teams, that people fears, unclarities, but also factual things. And we meet once per week, and then you can explain to us what you heard. And I want you to be uncomfortable. I want you to really tell me the truth because, and that's what he said, because I don't get to hear it from my C-level. Because from my C-level, I only get the beautiful news. And they really made a selection process. I was lucky to support on this. Who are the people who show this voice behavior? Who are the people who are not afraid to really speak their mind?
So that sounds like a good best practice. Like if you were to clarify that as a powerful kind of communication awareness, the grapevine, we call it the grapevine. I'm not sure what you might call it in Germany, is often a far more powerful source of real data than official communication. And it can be used very powerfully. And it sounds like you've got a good best practice there. I don't know, 30 years ago, I learned from Thomas, now I can't think of his, who wrote Service Excellence, Thomas.
Don't ask me for those names. I'm really...
sorry. Anyway, and he said that in their research in mergers and acquisitions, that executives were completely uninformed of what was happening 2 to 3 levels below them, that they were clueless to what was happening. And it took intentionality to be aware of what was happening in the organization that you were leading, and to learn about what was happening in the organization that you were leading with authenticity. So what would be a best practice that you're suggesting there?
So I think the part that you just, one thing that resonated, if I can quickly go back to this. So this of a guiding coalition of change agents, of the voluntary army, how Kotter calls it lately, is twofold. On one hand, it's really the upwards feedback, really giving people an idea what's really going on, what people need. But of course, the other part is really, who do you believe more as an employee? Do you believe more in what you hear from the C-level, or from your direct boss, or from the HR/PR department? Or do you prefer to hear it in the coffee corner or on the water cooler from your colleagues? And I think the answer is very often the high credibility is with the direct colleagues. So what they also did, and what I really found powerful, is that this group of 36 people, they always got first-hand information. They had their weekly talks with the C-level and said, okay, guys, spread the word. We're going to do the official communication as well. But if you're convinced, then I'm very convinced that you can convince other people as well. And I think this was very powerful too. For me, a new way of, and I think a modern way of really spreading the word all over the organization, not to go only top down, but really go, yeah.
Okay. And what was this called again? Potter's
Voluntary army, I think.
The voluntary army. Okay. So that kind of connects with some of what Patrick Lencioni, Death by Meetings, 5 dysfunctions of a team. Just love his stuff. And so he says that coming out of your meetings, what's your intentional cascading message? Like, leave those meetings and have agreement. I like to say, disagree at the table, and you got to walk out as a united front. You must choose, if you're part of this executive team and leadership team, to communicate in unity with everyone else, because everyone will read your hesitancy. And so how you use your mouth becomes very important, even with your closest friends. And so coming out of that executive room table, whatever tier of leadership you're in, what is the united cascading message that you are all agreeing to communicate together that will permeate the organization? And that just takes some intentionality. It doesn't take a lot, but it just takes some intentionality to come to agreement on. Does that make sense for you?
Yeah, totally. And we call this normally the message triangle. So I also normally refer to Lencioni and this 5 dysfunctions of teams. And I tell both to executive teams, but also to change teams. First of all, invest in yourself, which is, by the way, Kotter's step 2. So build a guiding coalition, invest into cohesion, trust, reliability, speak very explicitly about mutual expectations, but then also introduce some tools such as that one that I call message triangle. And it's kind of a standing item that I use in my change consulting work. I say, so whenever you take a decision, before you go out, take a piece of paper or whatever you do nowadays in the digital world, unite on why are we having this decision? What exactly is the decision and what is the implication? And maybe into the middle of the triangle, we would call it the desired key takeaway. What is the one sentence that people should take away from this communication? And then you hand it out to all executive members and say, this is your song sheet that you should use in the future. And then exactly you see how some people are saying, yeah, but I'm not so happy with it. And then you have to go back and say, okay, guys, then we are not allowed to leave the room, because if we're starting to do this, if one person says, yes, I completely believe in it, the second person, I'm not sure if I'm already going to talk about it, I wait a bit longer. Third one says, yeah, I'm a bit hesitant, let's see if it works. Then basically you lost the game. So I think it's a
yeah. So I'm curious, as we think about the world today, global leadership today, some of my stories come before the internet was out. I still remember Mary Lou Redmond, who I was connected with recently on LinkedIn, and I said, I remember you trying to explain what www meant and HTTP meant, and then I remember AOL and its in connecting me with friends around the world, and so that we could only chat, and that was a big deal because we couldn't have done this, certainly. And there's just so much transformation now. In the MBA class that I'm teaching right now, there are some people who are totally on board with AI. There are others who are trying to move from being threatened by AI and whether or not they're going to have a job. And so I'm curious, how do you see, maybe should we start with what doesn't work that used to work from your perspective? And what is new that we've got to do to be effective in leading change? If you were to say what doesn't work that used to work, what would you say?
I try to answer. I thought about this question a lot because in our preparation talks here, I think nobody can fully answer the question. But what I see is not working anymore is to enter a change with the mindset of, okay, we're going to do this now for the next 2 years, and then things going to calm down again. And maybe then in 5 or 7 or 10 years, we're going to do another organizational change or strategic change. So really this idea, and that's probably already since 10, 15 years, that there's constantly change going on, that it's a process, that we need a certain mindset for it. We need more agility. We need a growth mindset and all of this. I think this is very important for all sides. Still, I believe that executives have to be choiceful and to prioritize which changes are really necessary, which ones are really bringing us forward, and which ones are just the flavor of the month. So my key advice is from an employee side, really invest in your agility, into the mindset of change is a constant. And from an executive side, be choiceful, really think about, do we need another project? Do we really need to establish a new SAP version this year? Or is it not only enough that we moved offices and we moved here A, B, C, D? So that's one of the answer. Part two, when it comes to the digital world, my impression is, number one, that it's more necessary than ever before to bring people together into one room, to really talk about things, to really discuss, to create stages in which people can utter their fears, can talk about their resistance, their questions they have, and so on. And particularly because it's so much easier to just post something online and write it. That's what a lot of people do. People tend to be more opinionated, but oftentimes also less based on facts. But in our world where the attention span is shorter, maybe they hear something, they see half of a paragraph of an executive announcement, and then they say, I don't like it, and so on. And that's why I believe that even more we as change consultants have to invest into real focused conversations where people have the chance to really discuss with each other and create this stage for open communication. Does that make sense?
And all the digital stuff. What I kept thinking, as we went through the pandemic and everybody went digital, and some folks, have gotten accustomed to working from home. You and I have been doing that, forever, and on site with clients when we have on site work, but more of the world has gotten accustomed to working differently and remotely. And it's interesting that what I am expecting out of this is it will free up budget to bring people together. As a result, it will, and there might even be more of a human longing for it. I've got a friend that's doing some research right now on human connectivity and what makes us feel connected or not feel connected. And so it'll be interesting. I believe it is far too early to define anything about where we're at right now as a new normal. I believe we are still, I call it the interim normal. I call it the messy middle, that the floor is still shifting, and 10 years ago, I would do consulting with the Pepsi organizations in Chicago area. And I remember meeting with one of their groups, and they're saying, one of the things we've learned, you can't do a 10-year strategic plan anymore. We do 3-year strategic plans. And I've been thinking about it lately, and how one can create and craft and invest in a powerful 3-year strategic plan, but it sure has to have built into it a boatload of agility and taking in new data and adapting. This combination of an analysis and urgency and adaptability, I suppose. We said analysis, urgency, and adaptability in order to keep the organization moving, because who knows what the heck is going to happen, 3 months from now. It could change. And so what needs to change? What needs to stay the same? And I was thinking about, I worked with an American version of a Japanese corporation, and I would feel like they moved slowly on things. Their rhythm was moving slowly. Spent half of the year doing the next year's budget, and then the second half of the year, quarterly revisions of it. So everybody was always in budget revision mode about what they were going to spend money on. And of course, what you spend money on is what defines your values and your priorities. And the CFO at the time, he said that, well, we practice a Japanese term called namawashi. Did I say it right? I did. Nemawashi. Have you ever heard that word before?
Nope. I'm very
He
curious.
said, when we're making a decision
Mhm.
and say this is 100% of your decision, he said 80% of that decision is nemawashi, which means to dig around the roots.
Ah, interesting.
So you get it right. And then 10% is executing, or 20%, I think. Anyway. And so it's interesting that one can still, if they're comfortable with nemawashi, dig around the roots. But one's time frame for doing that now is you got to shrink that whole time frame for that analysis so that you can be adaptable. Because if you stretch it out too long, everything could, key factors could have changed that you're no longer able to consider because of the time that you're taking. And so everything just strikes me as needing to happen faster, which I'm curious, as we think about human beings, and I'm going to say one of the things that I love about the emotional process now, and how how organizations have a responsibility, and it makes them more effective to actually engage that process. And I'm holding my beautiful brain because what we know today about the brain compared to what we knew 20 years ago, 30, 10 years ago, it keeps changing, is that all of those emotions that we're going through that influence our behaviors, that influence, for instance, our competing commitments. So say we're going to, I'm a leader and I understand that we're going to transform this computer system and my team is going to get on board. It's going to make us more efficient. It's going to give us better data. It's going to align with corporate objectives. But I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job. Or I'm afraid team members are going to lose their job. And so unknowingly, because I'm not cognizant of these competing commitments, I stay stuck. And that stuckedness happens in here. It happens in the middle of your brain, right? And so emotions are actually physical. Mm-hmm. Emotions are physically wired in our brains, and our brains influence how we respond to things and the actions that we're going to take. And so it's interesting now how much more tools we have to help people move through that cycle more effectively and more authentically to get to the other side, or make a decision they don't want to, and they can go work someplace else, which is something I get to say all the time as a consultant, to say, you have a choice here. You're not being forced. And so it's just interesting that psychological process, we have an ability to help people move from getting stuck by naming these things and providing people opportunity to make choices along the way that move their brains kind of to more their prefrontal cortex and being able to engage their logic and their decision making. Does that make sense for you?
I loved your brain example. And to be honest, I'm not as deep into neuroscience as I probably should be, but there's 3 things I would like to add to what you just said. First of all, one of the sentence that resonated most with me and also with a lot of my training participants in chain trainings is from Ronald Heifetz, Adaptive Leadership, Harvard Kennedy School. He said, people are not afraid of change, people are afraid of loss. And I think much in it, because exactly that's what happens, anticipated loss. If this happens, I might lose my job. I might lose my face because I was arguing for another decision. I might lose my autonomy. I might lose my competence. And I think this is very powerful to think. People automatically start doing this internal balance sheet. By the way, one of the newest tools that I got to know from John Carter, it is personal change impact assessment, I call it. So people really see, okay, if this change comes, what is the pro for me? What is the con for me? And then they really go through different dimensions. And there, again, I don't know what you think of David Rock, but I still like the SCARF model because it's very simple to remember, to say, what about competencies? What about fairness? What about connections to other people? And that is the people on an individual level automatically do and say, okay, this might be great for the company, but I cannot work with my nice team ABC anymore. Or I don't have the autonomy to take decisions by myself. All of a sudden in the metrics, I have to discuss with this guy and that guy. And I think this is something we always need to keep in mind, right? We cannot just say, okay, it's good for the company, so I like it.
So my neuroscience, neuro leadership training comes from David Rock's organization. So I'm a David Rock groupie. And the Neuro Leadership Institute is what it is called. And so if I touch on the SCARF model, in sum, what David Rock has discovered by hooking up all kinds of electrodes to brains to understand how are we responding to change, how are we responding to innovation, collaboration, trust, that our brain is basically going to sort data that comes in. It's going to bifurcate. It's either going to move us towards trust and reward or threat. And the human brain in the midst of change craves certainty. And it will move to the certainty of what's going to go bad. I don't know what the number is, 75, 80, 90% more frequently than what will be good. So it takes an extraordinary amount of intentionality first to manage one's own mindset. And then if I add to that, then what they found are the reward and threat factors of the human brain. And it's interesting because it complements Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is what we've all learned about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Turns out that was an observational model as opposed to a physiologically researched model. And so they complement each other really nicely. And so S stands for status, the extent to which and I'm talking about the SCARF model here. So S stands for status. People who are highly driven by status are comparing themselves to others, and they want to know where they are ranked in comparison to others. C is for certainty. Our brain wants to know if I do A plus B plus C, that this will be the outcome. And if everything is changing around me, then how can I know that if I do A plus B plus C, I'm going to get a good performance review at the end of this cycle? And so providing certainty, I'll figure out how it won't work before I can figure out how it can work. So my brain feels certainty. A is autonomy. You're not the boss of me. I want to be part of decisions that affect me. R is relationships. I want to have relationships with whoever those people are that matter to me. And then F is fairness. And the Global Ethics Research Council has found that fairness is the most important ethical measure at the front line of an organization. And so just having conversations with people around how are you driven? Which of those are your most important? My most important are, I was surprised, status and autonomy. That's why I'm a consultant. Certainty is not important to me, but it's very important to many people. And so first looking at yourself and then say, hey, the people that are going to be experiencing this change who are on your team, what might be important drivers for them, threats for them, and how can you speak into that threat to provide them a sense of confidence in moving towards trust and reward? So just a really powerful model to work with. And I'm thinking in this conversation that we're going to need to put up a couple of things. I'd like to share a framework for the first best practice we talked about with the voluntary army and what that looks like. I think that the second one might be some of what we've learned about change and those cycles of change and some of Bridget's stuff as a tool. And then the third that might come out would be this SCARF model, which is, I just find that has revolutionized how I am able to understand and help people move forward as opposed to continue to resist change. If you were to say in our final couple of minutes here, Thomas, what would you say to executives who are stuck moving forward with change? Is there some wisdom that you might have, or their team is stuck? Is there a word of wisdom, a recommendation that you might have for somebody who's feeling stuck?
Many ideas, but if I really was to focus on two things, balance management and leadership more. Oftentimes I see that there is, I think it's also Kotter talks about ambidexterity, that you need both, right? So often I see that it's too much managed and underled, but I've also seen cases where it's maybe overled and undermanaged. That would be one. And when doing so, look into historical strengths of the organization, appeal to them. It has to do with communication, to be more emotional, to instill pride in people, to really look into what are we traditionally strong with. That oftentimes would be
I thought of the other model too. I think that's perfect. And I think we can pop up Cotter's framework for leadership and management. Management is about best practices and processes and structure that produces kind of consistency and stability and best practices. And leadership is about leading, casting a vision, inspiring, motivating others. And that's what produces change. And so I like to say that if I am not, I'm a leader more than a manager. And that means if I'm doing something, I need to have a trusted partner who is strong in the management side. And some people are ambidextrous. If you are on the management side, you need someone on your team who casts a vision and captures the hearts and minds of the people with you. So I think that is a brilliant, time-tested, long-lasting framework to think about what presence and energy and competence are you bringing into the organization. And so, Thomas, I just want to thank you. Every time, I just feel like this is a great conversation. And every time we have a conversation, they seem to be great conversations. We'll have a link to Thomas's organization if you want to reach out to him. He just does great work. I can't recommend him highly enough. And so thank you. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. And I'm looking forward as well to talk about this more. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Janine Peak-Emsick, and I am thrilled to have you join me on this journey of discovery and growth. Here on Your Authentic Executive, we believe that the heart of leadership lies in the stories that we live. After more than 3 decades of executive coaching and consulting, along with teaching leaders at both the MBA and doctoral levels, I've come to understand that the most powerful lessons come from mining the gold in our own life stories. Each month, we'll feature the story of an inspiring executive, delving into the pivotal moments and life lessons that have shaped how they lead today. And leading up to these rich narratives, I'm excited to introduce you to our Your Authentic Executive Sparks. These are 3 powerful lessons lifted from an executive's life that will light the way to our upcoming podcast. If you want to be the first to hear about new episodes of Your Authentic Executive and these illuminating sparks, be sure to follow me on LinkedIn or sign up for our mailing list at yourexecutivecoach.com. I can't wait to share these stories with you and explore the authentic leadership that lies within each of us.